Never have humans possessed so much weaponry capable of killing so many humans. And it's a situation that's getting aggravated by the situation in Israel and Palestine and Russia and Ukraine. And I'm honored to have our friend Matthew Holt on here. He's ex-Marine Lieutenant. Colonel, was it? Colonel?
Captain.
Captain.
It was a long time ago, so I can't do that nearly that many pull-ups anymore, so it doesn't even count anymore.
Well, I watched your eloquent speech briefing on Ukraine at the United Nations Security Council, where you're talking about the escalation ladder. In the context of what's going on around the world presently, how would you, put the escalation ladder into that?
Well, so the concept of the escalation ladder, and thanks, Sean, for having me on. I appreciate this. The concept of the escalation ladder is that in escalation theory, which is based upon the evidence we have from past conflicts, combatants have the option of escalating or de-escalating. There's no neutral or horizontal aspect to it. You either go up the ladder or you come down the ladder. And what you have happen in war, because it's the most extreme competition that humans have ever created, is that when one combatant, one adversary does something, the other is forced to respond. And more than not, it's a turning of the dial up a notch, right? So what you have in Ukraine, and we have seen this throughout the last 2.5 years, is this continual tit for tat. So whether it be escalation in the terms of the weaponry used, or whether it's in terms of the repercussions, in the sense of not the repercussions, but the actual targets being hit. So a couple examples I can give with regards to, say, the weapons provided by the West to Ukraine, such as things as like the HIMARS rockets. Things like that forced the Russians to respond with more advanced or adaptive weaponry of their own. So if you introduce HIMARS rockets or ATACMS missiles, the Russians introduced their glide bombs or their hypersonic missiles, right? That type of thing. If you introduce weaponry that has a longer range, like the Ukrainians have done, and you're able to hit targets within Russia now, well, the Russians, one thing they do is pull their bases back, but they also develop their weapons and extend their weapons so that these newest glide bombs, and the glide bombs are essentially old-fashioned regular bombs that the Russians have put wings and a tail fin and a GPS kit on, and they can launch these things from dozens of kilometers away, 30, 40, 50 kilometers away. And now, because of some of the more recent weaponry introduced to the Ukrainians, the Russians are coming out with glide bombs that can go as far as we dropped from 75, 80 kilometers away from their targets. So it just becomes just a tit for tat, where the ratcheting up, is just almost maniacal. And of course, as you climb this ladder, the higher you get to the ladder, the more choices you have to escalate, run out, because you're using up your different options. You're also, because of the repercussions and consequences of these actions, more likely to have horizontal escalation, which means bringing in others from the outside, right? So the more the Russian attacks provoke, annoy, upset NATO, there's more likely for NATO action in Ukraine. But then you also have, as you're getting to the top of the ladder, of course, you're running again out of options, and that leads you to the top rung, which of course is nuclear weapons. And all the theorists, all the analysts, the people who understood this stuff best, like Dan Ellsberg, who will tell you that once you get to there, it's over. There's no limited use of nuclear weapons. The idea of escalate to de-escalate is a fantasy, and we've actually most recently seen that in some of the statements, I believe, from the Russians, where the Russians were believed to have had an escalate to de-escalate policy, which it appears they have dropped because of the introduction of longer range missiles into Ukraine, but more importantly, the planned introduction of intermediate range cruise missiles into Germany in 2025, 2026 by the United States. I know that's a lot, but yeah.
No, we love a lot. We tell people don't cut a long story short here.
Well,
So
you're in trouble then.
so this foray into Russia by Ukraine, was that tantamount to the dance of the dying fly?
um, yeah, I mean, certainly in the final throes, or when someone's on their last legs or up against the ropes, right, you're going to be desperate. Uh, for the Ukrainian incursion into Russia, I view that mostly as a political maneuver, as a political stunt, meant, of course, to buck up morale in Ukraine, to try and decrease morale in Russia, but mostly and most importantly to retain support in the West. And so, whatever else you say about what Ukraine has done by invading Russia, you have to understand that this has, in the words of Politico, flipped the gloomy narrative about Ukraine. So the energy about Ukraine in Washington D.C., in London, in Brussels, is much different now than it was, say, a month ago. The Ukrainians went in, I think, August 6th or so. So a month ago, the narrative in the West was much different than it is now, because of this stunt by Ukraine. And that's where the benefit is for the Ukrainians. I mean, there's a lot of really tactical, operational, and strategic follies in that, but politically, and if you mean in terms of the military levels of warfare, you have tactical, you have operational, you have strategic. At the top is political. And that's something that people often forget, that the politics are, no, I'm sorry for those who are real military history buffs or amateur tacticians or strategists, but the politics is always what matters most. And so what you have is literally 2 or 3 days after Ukraine puts their troops into Russia, you have American senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, Graham a Republican, Blumenthal a Democrat, both in Kyiv, saying, this shows that we need another round of funding for Ukraine right now. That they need to get more. We can't give up on them. These Ukrainians have shown us that there's a pathway to victory here. And if you were in Washington, D.C., that's what you're going to hear. You're in London. If you were in Chicago 2 weeks ago at the Democratic National Convention, I'll bet you dollars to donuts, as we used to say, that was the narrative that was on the floor of the convention in Chicago, was this thing of, did you see what the Ukrainians just did? My God, we can't. And then that's coupled with an attack on Joe Biden, where he is being really hounded by both Democrats and Republicans now to do something about Ukraine. Joe, you're not running for election. You're a lame duck. You can really do whatever you want here. And what do you want your legacy to be? Do you want to be the man who stood up for democracy, who defeated the tyrant Vladimir Putin? Or do you want to be remembered as your last act to betray the Ukrainians? I mean, so the politics in this, it's so important. It influences and dominates everything. And so that's what I have to say about the Ukrainian incursion. I mean, certainly we could talk more about the other aspects about whether it was smart to do it, the costs were for the Ukrainians, what the implications are, how the Russians are going to respond. All of those things are important, of course. But for me, how this was geared to keep or to renew or to flip the narrative on Ukraine in the West is the most important thing.
Do you think Putin welcomed that move into Russia by Ukraine because it's like his chess opponent has made a blunder, and you can see how it's going to play out?
In some ways, I think so. In some ways, I think so. The certainly in the West, the attitude was, look how embarrassing this is for Putin. Look how this has shown that he's not really in control, how weak the Russian army is. Putin is panicking. He's in hiding. All the usual nonsense we hear in the West about Russia, its government, Vladimir Putin, et cetera. I've been a student of this stuff my whole life. I've never seen a government or a leader react so nonchalantly to an invasion of their land as the Russians have. And so they didn't take the bait. They have a large strategic reserve, the Russians, estimated to be 250,000 to 300,000 men that many thought would be redeployed, taken away from the Eastern Front in Ukraine to redeploy to this new Northern Front. That didn't happen. The hope was, I think, by many in Ukraine and the West, that this incursion into Russia would cause the Russians to slow down or even pause their advances in the east. Of course, that didn't happen. So certainly there has been no military cost to the Russians for this. They understand this for what it is. It was a stunt to keep the West motivated about the Ukraine war. They've evacuated a large part of the population there, and there weren't that many people there to begin with. This is a largely wooded rural area composed of villages and settlements, some towns. And the idea that this was going to be another stressor, it ties in as well to this idea in the West that all we got to do is put enough pressure on Russia, whether it's through that they're going to exhaust themselves through this war, or our sanctions are going to cause such discomfort that the stress put on onto the Russian people is going to cause them to rise up and overthrow Vladimir Putin and his government. And so a lot of the thinking on this war in terms of where the West and Ukraine should go comes back to that insane idea. So for Vladimir Putin, I think I don't know if he welcomed it because it certainly did throw off whatever plans the Russians had. The Russians obviously were not expecting it; they were not prepared for it. But they also didn't take the bait of rushing into it. They see it for what it is. This political stunt, no strategic or really operational threat to them. But it's what it does, though. Why I think we should be concerned about this is because when you look at Russia and you understand that the political system there, the political dynamics and the actors, you see what they say on Russian television, you see who is got the most pressure they can exert on Vladimir Putin, you see it comes from the hardliners, right? So if anyone really benefited from this invasion, it's those Russian hardliners, whether they're in media, whether they're former military, whether they're politicians, who have been saying for years now, predating Russia's invasion in 2022, that we have to be harder in Ukraine. Putin is being too soft in Ukraine. And this is where the ultimate folly of Western strategy lies, in the fact that if they were successful, which they won't be, but if they were successful and there was a coup and Vladimir Putin was pulled down, the guy who would replace him, probably someone none of us have ever heard of before, would be someone who was much more dangerous than Vladimir Putin.
All right, we've got 500 watching live presently. So wherever you are watching, and with ex-Marine Captain Matthew Ho, his links are in the description box, Substack, Twitter, etc. Please support his work and put your questions in the chat. I already got a bunch coming in, and we will get to those. I got another follow-up question there. Yeah. Would you say that Putin is being measured in how he's waging the war so far? Because technically, he could just nuke the capital and take out parliament. I mean, he's only using a fraction of his capabilities, isn't he?
He is. I mean, I would say, I mentioned before about turning the dial. If I would say that the Russians have been waging this war on a dial of 10, a 5, maybe a 6, right? You've seen increases in Russian attacks on, say, Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Russians have promised to go after other key Ukrainian infrastructure in the last months. They really haven't done that, but they still have really since 2 years ago gone after Ukrainian energy infrastructure. That, of course, goes back to what we were talking about before about the escalation ladder. That was a reaction to, one, the destruction, the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, which the Russians know it came from the West, whether it was from the Ukrainians, the Americans, whoever, they know it came from that side. And also to the first attack on the Kerch Bridge that connects Crimea to mainland Russia. That then precipitated or resulted in the Russians launching these strikes on Ukrainian civil infrastructure, if you will. The way Putin has been with this war, it has been limited from the start. They made a very real mistake, though, I believe. I think this is why overall the war is a strategic error for them, because they got stuck. They're stuck now in a way that I would describe as they don't want to advance much further west than what their stated goals are. So their stated goals for this war was the neutrality of Ukraine, the demilitarization, denazification of Ukraine, which is really more of a political statement than anything else. But the neutrality was certainly something very that could be agreed upon, and there's plenty of precedence for that. Austrian neutrality being probably the best one in this case. And then, but the third thing was, of course, what they saw as protecting the population of Eastern Ukraine, for make it simple, the Russian-speaking population that had been engaged in the civil war with, you know, again, make it simple, the Ukrainian-speaking population of Ukraine since 2014. I think the initial purpose, the original purpose or intent, which they were almost successful at, was to force negotiations. I think they had a clear understanding that the Ukrainians would go to negotiations, and the Ukrainians went to negotiations with the Russians right away, immediately. Within 2 days of the invasion, the Russians and the Ukrainians are talking via mediators in Belarus. Those talks then went down to Turkey, where the Turks facilitated it. You had former leaders of countries like Naftali Bennett of Israel, Gerhard Schroeder of Germany involved in these negotiations. And then by April of 2022, you actually have a deal in hand where both sides, both negotiating teams have initialed off on everything. And it just has to go to a summit between Zelensky and Putin to end the war. Essentially, what this would have done, this agreement said, was basically adhere to the rules that were established under the Minsk II agreements, which ended the fighting, the most of the fighting in 2015 in the East, established Eastern Ukraine as a somewhat autonomous part of Ukraine, adhere to that, as well as then Ukrainian neutrality, which is what the Ukrainians were offering, willing to do. Where the Russians made a mistake was they did not expect the West, particularly the Americans and the British, to be so heavy on the Ukrainians and to pull the Ukrainians out of those talks. And that's what occurs in April 2022. Famously, Boris Johnson goes to Kyiv and says to Volodymyr Zelensky, "You're not doing this deal." And now the Russians are in a war that, for them to conquer all of Ukraine, have a World War II style victory, is not what they want. And the further west so this is where I say they're stuck. The further west they advance, they're leaving the Russian speaking areas and they're going into the Ukrainian speaking areas. This makes them truly occupiers. And this makes them having to deal with a potential insurgency, which, if you go back to what many in the West were saying in early 2022, when this war started, this invasion happened, including former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, this is exactly what they wanted. This is what Hillary Clinton cackling about, how now we've got them where we want. We're going to do to them in Ukraine what we did to them in Afghanistan, right? Which is completely mind-blowing considering everything that happened after we trapped the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. But I mean, so that's it. But, you know, and then so they don't want to advance further west because they don't want to have more of this territory to control than they ever wanted to. But and also the problem is the West can keep Ukraine afloat with money as long as they want. I mean, I imagine, Joe Biden saying to Vladimir Putin, "Look, we spent $7 trillion on Iraq and Afghanistan. We can do the same thing here." You know, like that type of, we've got the world's reserve currency behind us. We can keep this thing going, not costing us anything. The Ukrainians are our pawns. They're our proxies. They're the ones whose boys are getting blown apart. And so, you know, now this is why I think it was a strategic error for the Russians, as well as the fact that the Russians had very real national security concerns. They were provoked. And they had absolutely very real national security concerns. And for me, though, when I look at it, I say, what were those national security concerns? It's the U.S. missiles that are in Poland and Romania that provide a 7-minute, 8-minute flight time to Moscow, right? And so I would say to the Russians, how does this remedy that? How did this action get those missiles out of Poland and Romania? And now, as we see, the U.S. is talking about they're saying they're going to put Tomahawk cruise missiles into Germany, next year or in 2026. So that's kind of my overall view on where the war's at, why I say it's in a stalemate, because neither side can knock each other out. Ukraine can't win and Russia can't lose, essentially. And so you can see this thing going on forever, because there are those in DC, London, and Brussels who will be happy to spend $150 billion a year, $200 billion a year, whatever it takes to keep this thing going. So it really is. It's an absolute moral horror, and it's sickening. And hanging over us, of course, is this very real threat of escalation to the point of conflict between Russia and NATO, which of course, most people can't see how that wouldn't go nuclear. And that's essentially what the Russians have been warning. I think one of the things, particularly too, about the Russian warnings recently, and I'll end my rant here, the Russian warnings recently, is that the way the United States has viewed the world for its entire existence is that we have a buffer. Right. So, Otto von Bismarck said, the United States has good neighbors to the north and the south, and they have fish to the east and the west. And that's the way we have viewed it. And then once ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, came along and took away the protection of the oceans, well, you know what? We're going to engage in policies that make it so that if nuclear war does start, it's going to start first in Europe. So if the Russians do launch a nuclear attack, it'll be Warsaw that's lost. It'll be Bucharest that's lost. It'll be Helsinki that's lost. And at that point, we can de-escalate. So here comes this escalate to de-escalate theory. And that's essentially what the Russians have said in so many words. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, said it pretty much that way recently, that no, if this does get to that point, we will directly attack the United States. And I don't think that's a warning that even if it has a 0.5% chance of being accurate or true, you have to take it with full certainty.
So a few people have asked as to whether you think if Trump becomes president, he can stop it. He's capable of stopping it. Or is it the case that no matter who becomes president, the military industrial complex dominates?
I think that's the case. I think it's that latter case, Sean. It's all going to depend upon who Trump puts into his cabinet. He ran as an anti-war candidate essentially in 2016, which he was not. And then when he took power, he put into his administration, a whole crew of neoconservatives. So we'll see what he does this time around. He is, I would say, the most malleable president we've ever had. So he can change his mind. So I wouldn't want to put money either way on what he would do. I think it is encouraging that you see he's got people out now. He's had Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard as well endorse him. And they've been pretty consistent on the war in Ukraine. So it as well as his vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance. So it's encouraging to see that. But where those people will be if he wins in January in terms of his cabinet appointments, if he puts in a Nikki Haley or a Tom Cotton at the State Department or at our Defense Department, we'll have a better idea of where he's going to go with this. But certainly, I think the Ukrainians were spooked by this prospect, and the Ukrainians, I believe, have been heartened to a great degree by the way Kamala Harris has been performing in the polls. The idea that Democrats would keep this war going while the Republicans won't. I mean, within the Republican Party, there's a pretty big split on this war. So that majority Republicans in the House and the Senate support the war, but there are a substantial minority that are against it. And so it'd be interesting to see if Trump did want to get out, what the Congress would do, particularly because of the influence of the military-industrial complex, what would happen with that. But yeah, I mean, trying to figure out what Trump is going to do, I think is a really difficult thing. Really difficult thing.
So you said it, it's kind of a stalemate. It could keep going, but wouldn't Ukraine run out of young men to use as cannon fodder? And to keep it going, then wouldn't NATO, the West, have to provide more serious assistance that could trigger Putin to go nuclear?
Well, one of the things, I think if you were to go into some of these rooms in Washington, D.C. or London, I think the idea would be we get to a point where the front line is not moving, either because the war truly is stalemated. The Russians just don't want to advance farther. The ability for the Russians to do so is limited by the use of drones, which have really changed the battle space in a lot of ways. You see the Russians, their advances now are on motorcycles and ATVs, right? It reminds me of this great book called The Forever War by, it's a science fiction book, and I'm sorry I'm blanking on his name. If somebody please in the comments put it. I'm sure people are familiar with it.
Mm.
But the idea is that the human race fights space aliens, and it gets to the point where we advance so far that we kind of go back to using sticks and rocks because those are the only things that'll work. And you see that on the front there, where they are using ATVs and motorcycles as a real part of their operations. So the hope would be in these offices in DC and in London, maybe in some in Kyiv as well, that the line is not moving, and that it now becomes an indirect war, a war of artillery, a war of missiles, a war of drones. And of course, that's exactly what the military-industrial complex runs, right? And that also is, for a country, any country throughout history, the way they motivate their people to in terms of supporting war and sustaining support for that war is through moralizing and scaremongering. And if it becomes just a story every day about the Russians shelling, bombing, droning Ukrainian civilians, that's a good way to, they see, keep morale for this war going in their own countries, right? I mean, and then it's just a system of we got to keep the Ukrainian economy afloat, which I think is the biggest danger for Ukraine. I don't believe a military collapse is the biggest danger. It certainly is there, but I think a collapse of the economy or a collapse of the government is a much greater danger to the Ukrainians than a collapse of the front. I think it's hard to know what the manpower is like for either side. I think it's a little easier understood in the Russian side. They're pretty flush right now. Their recruiting seems to be doing quite well. They've essentially doubled the size of their military forces in the last 2 years. They're doing okay. The Ukrainians, we have to remember that they have not really conscripted their young men yet. They had, up until a few months ago, the draft age was 27, which is completely opposite to what we know. And I know you have to kind of take a double take, and I still take a double take because it makes no sense. And in the last couple of months, they dropped it down to 25. So they still have the pool of men 25 and below who they haven't drafted yet. There is serious resistance to the draft throughout Ukraine. People probably familiar with the videos of the press gangs the Ukrainians use to break people away from their families and drag them off. And because it's almost, for many Ukrainians who get drafted into this, it's almost a death sentence, or at best, a sentence of getting severe physical damage. So yeah, that is probably the most pressing issue for the Ukrainians on the military side, is the manpower. But the idea in the West is if we can maneuver this in place so that the lines are basically frozen, the Russians have no incentive to really continue west, or at least not in a way that's going to endanger the stability of the country. Then we can dissolve just basically into these guys shooting drones, missiles, artillery at each other. Yeah, again, our factories are going to make a ton of money, and this is something very manageable from the moralizing and scaremongering part. And this is sustainable. We can keep the Ukrainians afloat, and we can have this endless war that we want. This is really important in Brussels for NATO, because if people remember several years ago, there was a legitimate conversation about, is NATO needed? And now, as far as the NATO proponents go, they see this as giving them their purpose. So if the Russians take and hold more of Eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, as well as, say, Crimea, that becomes the rallying cry for NATO. This gives NATO its sense of purpose, right? So Donetsk, it becomes the new Jerusalem, if you will. And so this is all very scary stuff in terms of, I think, how these people look at this, and how, even though you and I and everyone else can look at this and say, this is a horror show, this is a nightmare, it needs to end, this is unwinnable, particularly from the Western side, completely unwinnable, it needs to end. We have people in power throughout the West, DC, London, Brussels, etc., who see this as opportunity still.
So you talked about Hillary Clinton, and I have to contemplate on the psychopathic conscience or lack of conscience of these people. Madeleine Albright, when she was boasting, about how many died, and it was worth it. Hillary, we saw he died, and haven't these people, when it comes to Russia, learned from Napoleon, learned from Hitler? Right. You can go back to Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, whereby overextension in foreign wars was a huge contributory factor. Is there something in the collective psychology that just drives them into an inevitable self-destruction? Because that's what happened for Hitler and Napoleon.
Yeah, I think so. I think one, there has been 150 years at least in the, this is where the British American mindset like combines, really, right? I mean, like we when the Brits lost their empire, we assumed it, and this is important, I think, for American audiences to understand why we have these interests around the world, say like Israel. That why was this ever an interest to begin with of ours? And well, it's because we took it from the British. We took, right. I mean, we same in Vietnam. Why was Vietnam? Well, we took it from the French because we inherited their empire. I mean, so but so I think you have 150 years of Russia phobia, right? I mean, you go back to the 1850s, certainly the Crimea War. You look at how the British Parliament was hysterical throughout the 19th century about Russia. And then once, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution occurs and the commies are going to come and take all our money. Then of course you have the Great Red Scare in the United States. Most people in the West probably have no idea that there were Western armies in Russia during the Russian Civil War. I guarantee you probably 1 out of 50 Americans knows that the United States had troops in both Eastern and Western Russia during that time period. I mean, so it was just, Russia has been a reliable boogeyman for century and a half at least, right? So I think when you understand that framework and that you understand that this is what the empire has depended upon as part of its defining narrative, when you have an economy and a political system dependent upon war. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to understand is to look at in a sense of that following the Second World War, the United States and the West never stopped being at war. Right? You mean whether it's actual war, like say Korea and Vietnam, or it's the Cold War. So you always have this ongoing emergency. We're at war. There's no time to dialogue. There's no time to talk. This is why diplomacy is so decrepit in the West, because we don't have time for the diplomats. We're at war. The generals have to be in charge. Right. I mean, so like that type of thinking, again, keeps reinforcing the type of mindsets you're talking about with an Albright or a Clinton, who then, of course, this is how they're certainly going to have as good officers of the empire, their own views in terms of imperial views, but then their own personal agendas, their own understanding of how the system works. There's no way you're going to get to the top of the American political system without being on the right side of the American empire, whether that be sticking to the narrative, particularly that of American exceptionalism, that as well as the policing that comes from that. We're the guys with the white hats on, as well as staying in the good graces of the military industrial complex and all the other lobbies out there that dominate American politics. And that's how you can get to a point where you have someone like a Madeleine Albright, as you were saying, Sean, back in, I think it was in 95 or 96, when she's asked by Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes, it's believed 500,000 Iraqi children have died because of American sanctions. Do you think that was worth it? And Madeleine Albright says, it's been a hard choice, but we believe it's worth it. I mean, and she says it. And then years later, she never apologizes for it. She gets angry when asked about it because she feels she got ambushed in the question, but she never actually says, it doesn't matter if she said it anyway, because it wasn't like she contested that number at the time. She really does believe that type of exchange, that type of transaction for the benefit of the empire, for turning Iraq blue on the map, right? Like one big grand game of Risk is her obligation to the institution, but also the way for herself to be empowered.
So with people like that in power, is there any hope then? Do you foresee the possibility of nuclear war in this century? It seems like there's always a world war every century, but because of advancements in technology, the casualties get much worse. And now we've got the nuclear mutually assured destruction.
Yeah. And there's a lot of things that make the risk of what nuclear war would look like be unlike anything we've seen before. I think most people in our minds, we think nuclear war is going to come because of, say, something like out of Ukraine, right? Where you're going to have this conventional war that eventually builds up to nuclear war. But the reality is that it could come just as much or maybe more likely from a mistake or from mistrust. So certainly the history of the last 80 years of our nuclear era is filled with examples where one mistake after another has almost led to nuclear war. The example I like to cite is 1983, height of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. Ronald Reagan is calling the Russians the evil empire, the Soviet Union the evil empire. The United States has launched these major, NATO has launched these major war games in Europe called Able Archer, and the Soviet Union picks up on its early warning systems what looks like an American nuclear attack on Russia. And one man, a guy named Stanislav Petrov, decides this is probably a mistake, doesn't go forward in his reporting, and essentially saves us all because he had the courage to not do what the guidelines said to do, but to wait it out and see what happened. And thank God he did. And there are lots of other examples like that, throughout our history. So there's the idea that this could come from an accident, a mistake, someone reading something wrong, a computer error, right? You go back to Matthew Broderick and War Games from about the same time. One of the things that's very important, though, that we should really concentrate on now is that if you go back and you look at where we came closest to nuclear war, 1963, in Cuban Missile Crisis, both Jack Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev were entirely distrustful of their own people. And they end up establishing a backdoor channel. JFK famously used his brother to talk to the Soviets. And that saves the planet. That saves our civilization, right? But we had men like that. We had leaders like that, like Kennedy and Khrushchev, who were willing to talk to each other. Right now, I don't believe we know if there is a mechanism in place. I doubt there is. And the fact that we can't say for certain that there is really troubling. A mechanism in place for Joe Biden to talk to Vladimir Putin or to talk to Xi Jinping during any kind of emergency. That red phone, like we see in the movies, like I don't think that exists. And the fact that we can't ascertain whether it exists or not, that's really troubling. And then you've had advancements in nuclear weapons, particularly on the American side, that have completely upended that balance of power, of destruction, of firepower that underlines or girts this idea of mutually assured destruction. So the United States, starting in the Obama administration, started this massive modernization of nuclear weapons, $1.7 trillion over 30 years is what the estimate is. One of the components was making our the missiles on our nuclear submarines, so the Trident II missiles, more accurate. One of the things to understand with nuclear weapons is that, I guess primarily with any weapon, but accuracy is much more important than explosive yield, right? So the more accurate the nuclear weapon is, that makes the nuclear yield well less important. And so starting in the Obama administration, we started putting on our subs these things called super fuses. And at first it was on and the submarines carry two types of, now they carry three actually. And this is actually, that third thing is also troubling. The two types of warheads are W-88s and W-76s. The W-88s are over 400 kilotons of yield. For comparison, the Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons. The W-76s are about 100 kilotons, right? So still, many degrees greater than Hiroshima. These weapons were never accurate enough to hit the Soviet or the Russian or the Chinese ICBM silos, right? Because those are hardened, and they certainly weren't accurate enough to hit the Russian command and control centers, which are very far below ground and extremely well hardened. Well, with the W-88s, they first put this superfuse on. And so that makes it so that now we can use our nuclear submarines to take out the Russian ICBMs in a first strike. Because up until that point, if the subs aren't accurate enough to hit the silos, they're not good for a first strike because the Russians can still counter with those ICBMs. So in order to do a first strike, you have to use our land-based ICBMs, which come from the middle of our country, North Dakota, Montana, places like that. And it takes a half hour for those missiles to get there. But with the subs, you might only have a flight time of 15 minutes, So now you have this ability for the nuclear submarines to be a first strike weapon, something that the Russians do not have, something that certainly the Chinese don't have, because they don't even have nuclear submarines yet. They're building them, but they don't have them yet. So now you've had this really upending, right, of that balance that kept mutually assured destruction a real thing, something that we could kind of depend upon. And then I mentioned that there's third warhead, and I'm probably going into way more details than you guys want here, but a third warhead on the Trident II now is called a W76-2, which is a small warhead. What in both in all circles, because the Russians say the same thing, they have the same type of commentary, but we have generals and admirals and politicians and think tank pundits in the United States who say things like we have usable nuclear weapons. So the idea with the W76-2 is that it is a small nuclear warhead. I think it's 5 kilotons, so about a third the size of the Hiroshima bomb, and that it could be used in a way just to take out a small target, or could be used to, in a very limited manner. The problem being is when you launch a nuclear missile off a submarine, there's no way for the Russians or the Chinese to know whether it's got a 5 kiloton warhead on that missile or a 450 kiloton warhead like the W88 has, right? I mean, so you're playing with fire there, And the other thing too, just one more thing, I mentioned the command and control centers. Our submarines, because they've now put these superfuses on all the missiles, on both the W88, on all the warheads, both the W88s and W76s. That means our submarine fleet has the ability to not just take out in potentially 15 minutes the Russian missiles, but also the Chinese missiles, as well as the Russian and Chinese command and control facilities. We have the ability with our submarines now to do something in 15 minutes, which previously took 30 minutes to do. And that has upset the balance here in a really, really massive way. So when you see things about how the Chinese have gone from 300 nuclear missiles to now the estimates are going to have between 2,000 and 3,000 missiles, you understand why they're doing it.
My head's going to explode.
I'm sorry. I know that was a lot. I know. We nerdy about it.
We love detail. My head's going to explode at the possibilities of what could happen as this keeps escalating. It's so scary. People in the chat are, some of them are presently terrified. We've got almost 1,000 in the chats. And with ex-Marine Captain Matthew Ho, please support his Substack and Twitter. Links are in the description box if you are watching this on YouTube. We've got about 15, 20 more minutes to go, so put your questions in. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to hand it over to the questions that have come in. We were talking about psychopathic politicians. Netanyahu, is he trying to drag America into a war with Iran? And could that escalate into a situation with Russia as well?
I think he's trying to ensure that the Americans don't do anything that he doesn't want them to do. And he views the United States in a reversal of, I think, what many people would normally say. Hey, the U.S. is the empire. Israel's a vassal state. No, because of the American political system, because we have a system of legalized bribery, the Israeli lobby controls American Middle Eastern policy, just as our big agriculture industry controls our agriculture policy. Pharmaceutical companies control our healthcare policy. We have that when it comes to the Middle East. And so I don't think Netanyahu wants to engage in a knockdown, drag-out brawl with Iran, particularly as I don't think he can really count on the Americans to fully engage the way he wants them to. I think Netanyahu, because he's been doing this for 30 years, loves the idea of the Iranian boogeyman. I think Netanyahu wants to have this continual tension with a periodic acts of violence between the two countries to continue to, again, scaremonger and moralize among his base. So I think Netanyahu is happy for a war in Lebanon potentially, but I think he first and foremost his convictions lie in establishing Greater Israel. So his convictions lie in, we've seen it now multiple times, where he shows a map of the region and Palestine's not there, whether it's Gaza or the West Bank or whatever, it's assumed into the map of Israel. That's what he wants. If there has to be a war with Iran, I think he realizes that takes him away from their path, but he's also not going to back down from it. So he's willing to go right up to that line to play this game of chicken because he's got the United States strapped into the car with him. I mean, this is kind of reversal of the way things are with Russia, where the United States is playing chicken with Russia, and we believe we're not in the car. We believe the Ukrainians are in the car, so we can play chicken with Russia. In this case, Netanyahu's got us strapped in with him, and so I think that the thing about this is I don't believe the Iranians want war with Israel, and I think the axis of resistance, as it's called, the Iranians, the Hezbollah, the Iraqis, the Yemenis, the Palestinians, etc. I think what they're best to do, and I think this is what they are doing, is to play the long game, to try and exhaust Israel, because that's what Israel's doing, to needle it, to stress it enough that they start tearing apart themselves on the inside. And if you read the Israeli press, folks can go to Haaretz, English language daily out of Israel, you will see this commentary where you have very senior people in Israel, retired generals, the acting head of Shin Bet, Shin Bet is roughly the same as the MI5 or the FBI, warning about this. We're tearing ourselves apart. We are setting a pathway for our own destruction here with these policies. So I think that's the approach that the axis of resistance is looking for. And so I think what you see then is these this is not, of course, talking about what's happening to the Palestinians, is external to that, but you're going to have these periodic acts of violence, a lot of machismo, a lot of chest out type of posturing, periodic acts of violence, and eventually what I think the acts of resistance wants is to see Israel start to collapse from the inside. They won't collapse because they'll always have the United States in their corner, but to make it so that Israel and the U.S. are completely isolated. This is why you see countries like Turkey and others starting to really come into this idea of we have to build a hedge, we have to build an alternative, we have to do something to weigh against, to set against the U.S. and Israel. Because right now, take it from the Turks' perspective, I think if there was some sort of backing for the Turks that was equivalent to the American empire, right? So support that they could count on from the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Indians, whoever, that would balance the American empire. And they view the American empire in decline. So as these alternatives grow in strength, the American empire is declining. If they have that, and then this is the thing that's very concerning, gets back to our last what we were just talking about before, I believe also too, you'll see nuclear proliferation in the region. I mean, if you're the Turks right now, and if you had a nuclear weapon, you could put air patrols over Beirut, right? You could dare the Israeli Air Force to take on your Air Force over Lebanon. But now you can't, because if that escalates, the Israelis are going to nuke Ankara, right? So if you're the Turks, why don't you get a nuclear weapon? And the Pakistanis have said they'll give them to them. So the danger here in terms of where this goes, we may be at a point with this, where it's as horrid, as awful the genocide in Gaza is, what's occurring now in the West Bank, which I believe is a slow motion, localized replication of Israel's Gaza operations, that they're going to start unfolding more extensively into the West Bank. As horrible as that is, we may just be on like the precipice of something here. And the example I use, of course, is that if you go back to 1912, 1913, you have this horrible war in the Balkans where more than 1 million people are killed. There's all kinds of atrocity, ethnic cleansing, essentially, and nobody in the West ever thinks about that anymore. But if we were around in 1912, 1913, we'd be looking at that the way we look at, say, what's happening in Gaza, horrified, not realizing, except maybe with this type of, this premonition that what comes next. So this is my fear, is that we may just be on the starting path of a road that leads us into something that is much worse, or I don't want to say much worse, because I don't want to I don't want to diminish at all how awful the genocide is, but something larger than what we're seeing. And that's my concern. And for the Israelis, of course, they have to have the Americans. For the Israelis, they can become Fortress Israel as long as they have the Americans behind them, right? And for many of them, that's the right thing, because that's what their destiny is. Isn't this our history? Us against the world? Isn't this the way it should work out? That's the way for many Israelis, especially those on the religious side of it, but also too, even for the militarist nationalist side, there's that attitude. So Fortress Israel, so be it. That's the way it's always been, and that's the way it will be, is an option for them. And you get to this point where you wonder, in a number of years, will Israeli political leadership remind us of the Afghan Taliban, where they simply couldn't care about the rest of the world. They really can't care about their own people. They're just going to have their edicts. We don't care if our people starve. Women shouldn't show their skin, and the hell with the world. And, Israelis, will they resemble that? Not in those edicts, but of course, like in the sense that they're willing just to say, to hell with you. We're going to do what we do because we believe it. It's our conviction. It's our religion. It's our God. And we also have the great God of the American treasury behind us.
Right. We'll have to do quick fire answers on the rest of these questions because we only got less than 10 minutes left and we've got about a dozen questions. But fascinating so far. We really appreciate the breadth and scope of your knowledge. Ryan is asking, if things heat up, will China join Russia against the West?
I don't think so. I don't think the Chinese have any desire to do that. That's not their plan. That's not the way they see a vision for China going forward. I think that they will intervene diplomatically and prevent such a thing from happening before they would join in. But at the same time, too, though, you have to remember that the Chinese understand that, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the American generals said that if we go to nuclear war with Russia, we also must bomb China as well at the same time, even though Chinese had nothing to do with it, right? Chinese-Soviet relations at that point weren't very good. So but that's the mindset, and the Chinese know that. So yeah, of course, because they would be fearful that if it comes to that the Americans would attack them anyway, because they, to hedge. I mean, so this is where you start to get into this idea of if you don't have dialogue, you don't have conversations, there's no trust, and people have to go off of what they hear you saying on cable news, as well as history, you end up going down that path to war.
Thanks. All right. Question from Gene. What will be the safest country to be in? And if shit hits the fan, where will you yourself be?
I have read that New Zealand is the safest place to be. And I think there's some evidence, because you read those stories about billionaires building bunkers. Some of them are doing that down in New Zealand. I will be in my house with my dogs. Maybe I'll sleep through it. There's a story about how during the Carter administration, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, was woken at night and told the Russians are attacking us, and they held off. And he didn't wake up President Carter. He also didn't wake his wife. And in one of the few touching things about Brzezinski, because he's a criminal, but in Brzezinski, words, saying how he didn't want to wake his wife, let her just die in her sleep, and so hopefully that'll be the case. Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that. Okay, so Jed is wondering about how much money do the US and UK make from the taxes, munitions, manufacturers, billions? It's trillions. Haven't they spent almost 10 trillion on the wars?
Yeah. So just in terms of from 2001 through 2021, for the 20 years of, say, the global war on terror, right? The United States spent $16 trillion on the Pentagon and related functions. 16 trillion. Half of that went to weapons companies. Half, $8 trillion. So during that time, the weapons companies spent about $1 billion lobbying. So campaign contributions and things like that, right? Bribes, essentially. $1 billion lobbying, and they got $8 trillion out of it. So the system is set up. The reward is so great for this type of bribery, this corruption to occur. Yeah. So the amount of money being made on this is atmospheric. I mean, our defense budget this year will be $900 billion. When you actually calculate all the other things in, such as veterans care and our nuclear weapons program, our State Department, plus the interest and debt payments on past military spending, it comes out to about $1.4 trillion a year. So that's the American military Leviathan. That's the American military industrial complex. You can imagine the inertia that it has. And then when you couple that with the narrative of American exceptionalism, that somehow the United States were always still fighting World War II, the political media aspect of it is, a Leviathan itself.
And all that money's not going to be worth jack shit if these
Right.
elites are perishing in the nuclear bunkers during a nuclear winter in New Zealand. How long can they last? I don't think they're going to, it's not something you can sustain. Is
Yeah.
is Russia prepared to take on NATO? Question from Alfred.
I think they're preparing for it. They certainly prepared for this war in Ukraine, the way they built out their defense industrial base, the way they had the ability to expand their military and to bring in recruits as they did. I mean, for a country to roughly double its size of its military in a couple of years, that's an enormous undertaking, right? And so they have that ability there. I think this is why also too, I spoke earlier about the Russians supposedly have a 250,000, 300,000 man strategic reserve that they haven't utilized, and they didn't use it to kick the Ukrainians out of Kursk. And I think that's a lot of it. They got to hold those back because they are generally afraid of going to war with NATO. To take them on in a conventional sense, I just don't see how that goes not to a nuclear war at some point, just based on the doctrines of these countries, the long range fire, the long range strikes that these countries would utilize deep inside each other's countries, particularly for the Russian side, that would necessitate the return fire essentially of nuclear weapons. And that then blows up into this worldwide nuclear war. And as we know, the Russians just said they're changing their policies, and those nuclear weapons would strike the US at the same time they were striking Europe. So for us Americans, for us Yanks, there goes our buffer zone. You guys were our buffer zone, and now the Russians are telling us we don't have a buffer zone anymore.
Do you think there will ever be peace with the nations?
That's the only way. T.H. White, who wrote, I think, one of the best political books of all time, The Once and Future King, about King Arthur, and then he had the Book of Merlin to follow it. He said something along the lines of like, unity is mankind's destiny. Anything else, and we end up back in the trees like monkeys throwing sticks at each other. Except he didn't say sticks. You can imagine what he said, but that's where we have to go. There's no other alternative than that type of international cooperation, that type of international dialogue, that type of international peace. A friend of mine, George, he says, it's perpetually 2020. We can be dead we can be dead in 20 minutes from nuclear war, or dead in 20 years from climate change. I mean, so we have these two great threats, as well as all kinds of other issues, that the only way we can overcome those is through unity.
But it seems there's something immutable and warlike about human nature. And Adam Smith said that peaceful nations will always be conquered by the warlike aggressor nations.
Right.
And it just goes round and round in a cycle.
Yeah, just Thucydides, right? The strong nations will do as they want, and the weak nations will suffer as they must. Yeah.
What a way to end it. This has been absolutely fascinating, Matthew. Really appreciate you spending this time with us.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate it.
Why should people check out your Substack and Twitter?
Certainly, if you want an independent and I try to be objective analysis and commentary of issues of war and peace. I throw in some of my personal experiences, and it is in that vein of that peace is just not the moral thing to do. It's just not the right thing to do for reasons of the suffering and the pain and everything else, destruction. But it's also the only practical thing to do. If we want to advance, if we still want to be here in 100 years, but if we want to have a better life, coordination, cooperation through peace is the only thing that's going to allow for that.
And we commend you for your work. And the other link down there I've put, it's on Judge Napolitano's channel. Your eloquent speech to the UNSC, the briefing on Ukraine. So people, please check that out as well. And we salute your work and thank you for joining us. Cheers.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate it so much. And thanks everyone for watching.
All right. Take care. Thank you. What an absolutely fantastic guest. Thank you for all of your questions. And, it should be the biggest thing on people's minds right now, isn't it? If any of these situations escalate out of control because we have the capabilities to just wipe out most of the human population of the world just so rapidly. Like I said, my head felt like it was going to explode at one point, just listening to all the various scenarios that Matthew was talking about, the different bombs, the loads of the bombs, how many minutes it takes to get here, how many minutes to shoot down this. And it's to think that this could possibly happen again because of the greed of the demonic military-industrial complex, and how it rides roughshod over government policy, no matter which political party gains power. So I know many people are hoping that if Trump gets in, he can make some changes and override this. But there's also the theory that because the shot is here, he now knows how easily they can take him out, and he will cow down even more. So it remains to be seen what will happen there. But thank you everyone for tuning in, and we will be back with more content tomorrow. And we will see you then. And support Matthew at his links. Like I said, they're all in the description box below this video. So take care.